The rope had frozen to her skin by the time someone finally whispered, "This has gone too far." Wyoming Territory, December 1918. The fire crackled in the stone hearth of the Branson Ranch house, casting dancing shadows across weathered pine walls. Outside, snow fell in thick curtains, the kind of storm that buried fence posts in memories alike. Cole Branson, 78 years old now, sat in his grandfather's chair, the leather worn smooth by decades of weight and worry. Across from him, his great-nephew Jake, perched forward on a wooden stool, 16 years young and hungry for stories the way only the young can be. The boy's eyes had settled on Cole's left wrist, where a scar ran white and jagged across the tendons, the kind of mark a bullet leaves when it passes too close to bone. "Grandpa Cole," Jake said, using the title earned through affection rather than direct lineage. "You never told me how you got that scar." The old man looked down at his wrist, turning it slowly in the firelight. The scar had faded over 40 years, but the memory behind it remained sharp as broken glass. "Son," Cole said, his voice carrying the gravel of age and the weight of truth, "there are things in a man's life he must do, not because they're easy, not because they're safe, but because they're right. This story happened 40 winters ago in 1878, when I stood between safety and honor. I chose honor, and it nearly killed me." Jake leaned closer, the fire reflecting in his eager eyes. "It all began," Cole continued, "with a rope and a woman's cry I'd never heard before, but recognized in my bones. A cry out I'd failed to answer once before, 15 years earlier, when my sister Sarah needed me most. This time I swore it would be different." The old man closed his eyes and the present dissolved like snow in warm hands. Wyoming Territory, December 15th, 1878. The morning started the way most winter mornings did in Fort Bridger, with cold that turned breath into clouds and made leather brittle as old bone. 12 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that found every crack in a man's defenses. The town huddled in a valley where the Oregon Trail had once carried thousands westward toward promises of gold and land. Now it held 400 souls, most of them trying to survive one more winter through cattle ranching, timber cutting, and the kind of quiet desperation that comes from being isolated by snow for months at a time. Cole Branson stood in the north pasture of his 120-acre spread, his breath forming ice crystals in his beard as he examined a section of fence damaged by last week's storm. At 38, he carried himself with the economy of movement that comes from understanding the cost of wasted energy in hard country. 6'3", broad across the shoulders, weathered by sun and wind until his face looked carved from the same granite as the mountains behind him. His hands, bare despite the cold because gloves made fence work clumsy, bore calluses thick as boot leather. The fence post had rotted from the inside out, undermined by beetles that had worked unseen through summer and fall. Cole studied it with the attention a surgeon might give a wound, seeing not just the surface damage, but the structural failure beneath. He'd need to dig it out, sink a new post in ground frozen hard as iron, and restring the barbed wire that Thomas Edison's company had started manufacturing just 4 years earlier. $20 a roll, expensive enough that every strand had to count. As he worked, his mind drifted to the past the way it often did in solitary moments. 3 years since Emma had died, coughing blood into her handkerchief while winter pneumonia filled her lungs. They'd had no children, a sorrow that had slowly become acceptance, then a kind of peace. He'd been alone since, not from choice, but from the simple mathematics of survival. Running a ranch alone took all the hours God provided, and then some. But it was his sister Sarah who haunted his thoughts on mornings like this. 15 years dead now, but the guilt remained fresh as yesterday's wound. Sarah had been 19 when their father arranged her marriage to a man twice her age, a merchant from Laramie with money and a reputation for business. What no one knew, what only Sarah had discovered too late, was that the merchant's reputation should have included the word cruel. She'd written Cole letters, increasingly desperate, describing bruises she explained away to neighbors, describing fear that lived in her bones. Cole had been 23 then, working a cattle drive in Montana, too far away and too caught up in his own ambitions to see the truth bleeding through her careful words. By the time he returned, by the time he understood, Sarah had walked into the Laramie River in February with stones in her pockets. The memory of finding her body, pulled from the ice by men who looked at Cole with pity and judgment in equal measure, had carved something permanent into his soul. A vow, simple and absolute. Never again would he stand by while a woman suffered. Never again would he let distance or doubt or his own comfort keep him from acting when action was needed. He was thinking about Sarah, about stones and ice and letters he'd answered too late when he saddled his horse to ride into town for supplies. Meanwhile, in Fort Bridger, Grace Margaret Hartley stood in her father's study, holding a letter that had just destroyed her life. The study smelled of tobacco and leather, expensive things imported from back east, symbols of the wealth and status her father Thomas Hartley had built through careful banking and careful marriages. Grace herself, at 24, carried herself with the posture taught by finishing school in Boston, but beneath the practice of grace lay a steel core her teachers had never quite managed to bend. Thomas Hartley sat behind his mahogany desk, 52 years old and looking 60. His hands trembled as he poured whiskey into a crystal tumbler at 10 in the morning, a habit that had grown from occasional to constant over the past 2 years. "Grace," he said, not meeting her eyes, "you have to understand, I had no choice." The letter in Grace's hand was from Raymond Blackwell. 3 sentences, each one a nail in a coffin. The bank debt of $8,000 was due. Thomas couldn't pay, but Raymond would forgive the entire amount if Grace agreed to marry him. "No choice?" Grace's voice stayed level through sheer force of will. "You're selling me like cattle to pay your gambling debts." Thomas flinched at the word gambling, which confirmed everything Grace had suspected about where the bank's money had really gone. The poker games above the saloon, the trips to Cheyenne that lasted 3 days and returned with empty pockets and hollow eyes. "Raymond Blackwell is a respected businessman," Thomas said, the words sounding rehearsed. "He owns half the land between here and Rock Springs. You'd want for nothing." "Accept a choice," Grace said. "Accept my life." She'd met Raymond Blackwell exactly 3 times, all at formal occasions where his cold eyes had evaluated her the way a rancher evaluates livestock. 45 years old, tall and lean as a starving wolf, dressed always in black suits that made him look like an undertaker. His smile never reached his eyes, and the 2 women who'd been his wives before were both dead under circumstances the town didn't question because Raymond Blackwell owned their silence through fear and money in equal measure. Grace had also heard rumors, whispered by the doctor's nurse after too much wine at a church social, that both women had died in their sleep, peacefully, with no warning. "Too peaceful," the nurse had said. "Too sudden." "I won't do it," Grace said. Thomas's face hardened, alcohol and desperation replacing whatever fatherly love might have lived there once. "You're 24 and unmarried, living in my house under my legal guardianship according to territorial law. You'll do as you're told." "I'd rather die." The words hung in the air between them, honest and terrible. "That," Thomas said quietly, "can be arranged." A week later, Grace stood in the town square at dawn, hands bound behind her back, a rope around her waist, and the entire town watching as her father explained her crimes. "Theft," he said, $800 stolen from the bank's safe. A daughter's betrayal of her father's trust. The law in Fort Bridger was simple and public. Sheriff Edmund Wilson, a man whose weekly wages included a $50 payment from Raymond Blackwell's pocket, had declared the punishment. Grace would be tied to a wagon and dragged through the main street from the church to the town square, a distance of 2 miles. Not violently enough to kill, Wilson assured the gathered crowd, but slowly enough that everyone would see. Slowly enough that the humiliation would mark her more permanently than any physical wound. The temperature stood at 12 degrees below zero. Grace wore only a thin dress, torn at the shoulder from where her father's men had dragged her from her locked bedroom. Her hair, usually pinned in proper Boston fashion, hung loose and wild around a face gone pale with cold and shock. She'd stopped crying hours ago, stopped begging the night before. Now she simply stood, rope biting into flesh through the fabric of her dress, and waited for whatever came next. The crowd gathered, slowly, reluctantly. Miss Miller, who ran the dry goods store, wept quietly into her handkerchief but did not speak. Reverend Hendricks bowed his head in prayer but made no move to intervene. A few young men, paid by Raymond to create the proper atmosphere, laughed and jeered, their voices too loud in the cold morning air. Thomas Hartley stood on the porch of his bank, refusing to watch, but unable to leave. His face had aged 10 years in a week. Grace whispered, voice barely carrying over the creak of the wagon wheels. Please, someone, please stop this. No one moved. No one answered. In Fort Bridger, you didn't interfere with Thomas Hartley's business, and you certainly didn't cross Raymond Blackwell. The wagon jerked forward, Grace stumbled, boots scraping against frozen ground, the rope pulling tight enough to steal her breath. She managed 2 steps before falling, and the wagon dragged her 5 feet before Sheriff Wilson pulled the horse to a halt, allowing her to regain her feet. The crowd watched in the terrible silence that comes from witnessing injustice and choosing comfort over courage. That's when the first twist arrived, riding a black horse and wearing a smile like a knife. Raymond Blackwell appeared from the north end of the street, his timing too perfect to be accidental. He'd been waiting, Grace realized with sick certainty, waiting for exactly this moment when she'd been broken down enough to accept any escape. He rode slowly, dressed in black wool coat and beaver hat, looking prosperous and powerful while the woman who'd refused him lay in the dirt. He stopped his horse beside the wagon, looking down at Grace with an expression that might have been pity if his eyes had held any warmth at all. Thomas, Raymond called it out, his voice carrying easily in the cold air. When your daughter has learned proper gratitude for the opportunities offered to her, perhaps we can discuss terms again. I'm a forgiving man. The words landed like stones. This wasn't punishment for theft. Everyone in the square suddenly understood. This was revenge for refusal. This was a demonstration of power, a public breaking designed to make Grace pliable enough to accept any alternative to continued suffering. The crowd's mood shifted. Murmurs spread like wind through wheat. Even in Fort Bridger, even in 1878, there were lines you didn't cross. Using the law to force a woman into marriage crossed those lines. But no one moved. No one spoke. Raymond Blackwell owned too much, knew too much, controlled too much of their lives to risk his anger. No one moved, that is, until a figure stepped out from the shadow of the blacksmith's awning. Cole Branson had arrived in town 15 minutes earlier, tying his horse outside the general store, planning to buy nails and wire and ammunition and be gone within an hour. He'd heard the commotion, seen the crowd, and assumed some minor excitement he could ignore. Then he'd heard Grace's whisper, "Please, someone." The sound drove into him like a spike. Sarah's voice, 15 years dead, begging him to see what everyone else pretended didn't exist. Sarah's voice, asking for rescue that came too late. Not again. Not ever again. Cole stood 6'3" and weighed 200 pounds of muscle, built by decades of physical labor. When he stepped into the street, his shadow fell across Grace like a physical thing, blocking the weak December sun. His voice, when he spoke, carried no anger, no heat, just the flat certainty of a man stating absolute truth. That's far enough. The horse stopped, not because Sheriff Wilson pulled the reins, but because something in Cole's tone made even the animal hesitate. Wilson turned, hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "Branson, this is town business. Stay out of it." Cole walked forward, each step deliberate, his boots crunching on snow and frozen mud. He kept his hands visible, away from his own gun, but his presence alone shifted the square's atmosphere from observation to confrontation. "Dragging a woman through ice ain't business," Cole said. "That's cruelty, and I don't stand by for cruelty." Raymond Blackwell studied Cole with the attention of a man assessing a threat. They'd never met directly, though Cole knew of Raymond the way everyone in the territory knew of men who accumulated power through methods that stayed just inside the law. "You're mistaken, cowboy," Raymond said, his voice smooth as snake oil. "This is a legal punishment for a legal crime." Cole's eyes moved from Raymond to Grace, seeing her properly for the first time. Young, maybe half his age, dark hair tangled with ice, blue eyes wide with shock and something else. Not hope, not yet, but recognition. The recognition of someone drowning who's just spotted a piece of driftwood. "I don't know what they accused you of," Cole said, speaking directly to Grace now, his voice gentling. "But no accusation justifies this. Not in front of me." Grace stared at him, this stranger with ice in his beard and something immovable in his stance. "You don't even know me," she whispered. Cole knelt beside her, ignoring Sheriff Wilson's shout of protest, ignoring Raymond's cold stare. He met Grace's eyes at her level, and when he spoke, several people in the crowd looked away in shame. I don't need to know you to see this is wrong. His knife appeared in his hand, 6 inches of Sheffield steel, the blade worn but sharp. He reached for the rope at Grace's waist, not cutting yet, just placing his hand there to stop its forward pull. Now wait just a damn minute, Sheriff Wilson blustered, climbing down from the wagon seat. You interfere with this punishment, and I'll arrest you for obstruction. Cole didn't look at Wilson. He kept his eyes on Grace. If you trust me, nod once. Grace looked at this man, this stranger, and saw something she hadn't seen in her father's eyes for years. She saw someone who meant what he said. She nodded. The knife moved once. The rope parted with a sound like a saw. The severed end fell into the snow. That's it, Wilson said, reaching for his gun. You're under arrest. Doc Samuel Morrison stepped out of the crowd. 62 years old, the town's physician for 30 years, one of the few men whose reputation carried weight independent of money. Wilson, he said clearly, if that girl dies of exposure because you dragged her through a blizzard, I'll testify at your trial that this was murder, not punishment. You want that on your record? Wilson hesitated. Cole used that hesitation to remove his heavy coat, a buffalo hide lined with wool that had cost him 2 months' wages 5 years earlier. He draped it around Grace's shoulders. It swallowed her, falling almost to her knees, but the warmth of it made her gasp. Can you stand? Cole asked. Grace tried. Her legs shook, whether from cold or shock or relief she couldn't tell. But Cole's hand steadied her elbow, supporting without controlling, and she found her feet. Raymond Blackwell's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Branson, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. I own this town. Sheriff, arrest him for assault and obstruction. But Cole was already moving, lifting Grace with casual strength, setting her on his horse like she weighed nothing at all. He swung up behind her, reins in hand, and the horse responded to pressure from his knees. Anyone follows, Cole said, his voice carrying across the square. They answer to me. He rode north out of Fort Bridger at a walk, not a gallop, his posture straight and calm as if he'd just completed normal business. Grace sat in front of him, wrapped in his coat, her body shaking with something that might have been tears or laughter or simply the release of tension held too long. Behind them, the crowd stood frozen. Thomas Hartley sagged against the bank's wall. Sheriff Wilson looked to Raymond for instructions, and Raymond Blackwell smiled, cold and patient, the smile of a man who knows that winter is long and memory is longer, and that there are many ways to make people pay for defiance. 5 miles north of town, Cole stopped up beside a frozen creek. He dismounted first, then helped Grace down, his hands careful and respectful. He gathered deadwood, built a fire with the efficiency of long practice, and only when flames crackled strong did he speak again. What's your name? Grace Hartley. Her voice had steadied, but her hands still trembled. Why did you do that? You don't know me. You don't know what I did. Cole fed another branch into the fire, studying the flames. I had a sister once, Sarah. She was 19 when our father married her off to a man who hurt her. She wrote me letters. I was working cattle drives, too far away, too young to understand what she wasn't saying directly. By the time I came home, by the time I understood, she'd walked into a river with stones in her pockets. The confession fell between them like a stone of its own. That was 15 years ago, Cole continued. I swore I'd never stand by again. Never let distance or doubt keep me from acting when someone needed help. So when I heard you ask for someone to stop it, I heard my sister's voice, and this time, I was close enough to answer. Grace pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. They'll come after you. Raymond Blackwell doesn't forgive. Probably. Cole looked at her directly. Tell me true. Did you steal from your father? No, he owes Raymond $8,000 from gambling debts. Raymond said he'd forgive the debt if I married him. I refused. So they invented the theft charge to break me down until I'd accept anything to make it stop. Cole nodded, unsurprised. He'd seen enough of the world to know how power worked, how it bent law and truth to serve itself. Raymond's wives, the 2 before, they died, didn't they? Grace's eyes widened. How did you know? Lucky guess. Rich man, two dead wives, nobody asked questions. It's a pattern. He stood, brushing snow from his pants. 20 miles east is Redemption Creek. Smaller town, different jurisdiction. They've got their own marshal who doesn't answer to Fort Bridger. We get you there, we can contact the U.S. Marshal Service in Cheyenne. Start a proper investigation. Grace said. You're going with me? Can't very well start this and leave you halfway. Cole began gathering their minimal supplies. But I need you to understand, it's 20 miles in winter, temperature's dropping. We've got maybe 6 hours of daylight. Raymond will send men after us, probably already has. This gets harder before it gets easier. Grace stood, still wrapped in his coat, and Cole saw something shift in her face. Not from victim to survivor. That would take time. But from paralyzed to moving, from drowning to swimming. I understand, she said. They were preparing to mount when hoofbeats echoed from the direction of town. Cole's hand went to his gun, but the rider who appeared was just a boy, maybe 12, on a pony too small for the pace he'd set. Tim Fletcher, the blacksmith's son, pulled up in a spray of snow. Mr. Branson, he gasped. Pa sent me to warn you. Raymond's posted $500 reward for Miss Hartley. Dead or alive, he said, and he's hired the Cullen brothers, Pete and Jim. They're trackers and they're mean, and they left town 30 minutes ago. Cole's jaw tightened. The Cullen brothers, he knew them by reputation. Bounty hunters who worked the territory, men who'd learned tracking from Indians and cruelty from the war. Not the kind who gave up easy or fought fair. He looked at Grace, seeing her process this new information, watching fear try to reclaim the ground courage had just won. Thank your pa, Cole told Tim. Tell him I'll remember this. The boy nodded and wheeled his pony back toward town, leaving Cole and Grace alone with the knowledge that their 6-hour head start had just become 30 minutes. Cole checked his Colt revolver. 6 rounds, well-maintained, accurate to 50 yards in his hands. He had a Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard. 15 rounds in that. His knife, his skills. Against 2 men who made their living hunting humans through wilderness. Can you ride hard? He asked Grace. She nodded, though he saw the fear beneath her determination. Then we ride, and we don't stop until we have to. They mounted, Grace in front again, Cole behind, and the horse moved from walk to trot to canter, carrying them east toward Redemption Creek and whatever waited between here and there. Behind them, the smoke from their fire rose straight up in the still air, a marker visible for miles, a trail as clear as painted signs. In Fort Bridger, Raymond Blackwell stood in Sheriff Wilson's office, looking at a map of the territory spread across a scarred wooden desk. His finger traced the route east. They'll try for Redemption Creek, Raymond said. It's the closest sanctuary, but it's 20 miles through rough country and the temperature's dropping. They won't make it by nightfall. Pete and Jim will catch it in the high pass. Wilson shifted uncomfortably. Raymond, this has gone pretty far. Maybe we should just let her go. The debt can be renegotiated. Raymond's eyes, when they turned on Wilson, carried all the warmth of a January wind. The debt was never about money, Edmund. It was about teaching a lesson. No one refuses me. No one embarrasses me in my own town. And certainly no broken-down cowboy makes me look weak in front of half the territory. He smiled, and the smile was worse than his anger. Bring her back. Dead is acceptable. But if possible, I'd prefer alive. I want Grace to watch what happens to heroes who interfere in my business. Wilson nodded, sick but complicit, bound to Raymond by money and secrets, and the cowardice that calcifies in men who choose comfort over conscience. In the high country, as afternoon shadows stretched long and blue across the snow, Cole and Grace rode hard, the horse's breath coming in great plumes of steam, their own faces raw from wind and cold. Behind them, visible when they paused to rest the horse, 2 figures followed, the Cullen brothers. Closer now, patient as wolves, knowing that night falls fast in December and cold kills as surely as bullets. Grace felt Cole's arms around her, steady and sure, felt the rhythm of the horse beneath them, felt the weight of pursuit behind them. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something besides fear. She felt anger at her father for choosing debt over daughter, anger at a town that watched her suffering and looked away, Anger at Raymond Blackwell for believing money made him God. And underneath the anger, something harder and colder. Determination. If she was going to die in these mountains, she'd die fighting. She'd die herself, not the broken thing they tried to make her. Cole felt her stiffen, felt something change in how she sat in the saddle. "You all right?" he asked. "No," Grace said, "but I will be. One way or another, I will be." Cole understood. He'd felt that same shift 15 years ago, standing over Sarah's grave, making promises to the dead that shaped everything that came after. Sometimes you had to touch bottom before you found solid ground to push against. "Good," he said, "because this gets worse before it gets better. And I need you angry, not scared. Angry keeps you alive." They rode on as the sun touched the western peaks and the temperature began its nightly plunge toward dangerous. Behind them, the Cullen brothers smiled, reading the tracks, knowing that wounded prey runs until it falls. And somewhere in the mathematics of miles and cold and time, the first day of Grace Hartley's freedom counted down toward a night that would test whether courage could survive when everything else had frozen solid. Back in 1918, Old Cole paused in his telling, reaching for the whiskey bottle on the table beside his chair. Jake sat motionless, completely absorbed, the fire burning low. "That's where the first day ended," Cole said. "Cold enough to kill, pursued by men who made killing their profession. And Grace and I barely knew each other's names, let alone whether we'd survive the next sunrise." "But you did survive," Jake said. "Obviously." Cole smiled, a ghost of the expression that had once made him formidable. "Obviously. But survival and living are different things. What happened in those next days, the choices we made, the lines we crossed, those are what made the difference. Pour some more wood on that fire, Bo. This next part, you'll want it to be warm while hearing about how cold it got." Jake fed the fire while snow continued to fall outside. 40 years later, winter keeping its eternal appointment with the high country, indifferent to the stories humans told while waiting for spring. The fire had burned down to coals in the 1918 hearth, casting red light across Cole's weathered face. Jake added another split log, watching sparks spiral upward, like memories taking flight. "The pursuit," Cole said, his voice dropping to the tone reserved for hard truths, "lasted 6 days. 6 days when every decision meant life or death, when cold and hunger and fear tested everything we thought we knew about survival. But I learned something in those days that no amount of peaceful living teaches. I learned that a man finds out who he really is not in comfort, but in the narrow space between giving up and going on." He took a slow drink, eyes distant, seeing snow that fell 40 years ago. And Grace, when continued, she learned that being saved and saving yourself are two different things entirely. Wyoming Territory, December 15th. Evening of the first day. The temperature had dropped to 18 below zero by the time Cole found shelter, a granite overhang in a stand of lodgepole pines that offered protection from 3 directions. Not a cave, not comfortable, but enough to keep them alive through the night if he could build fire and maintain it. Grace slid from the horse, her legs nearly buckling. They'd ridden hard for 6 hours, stopping only twice to rest the animal and check their back trail. The Cullen brothers had stayed visible, never closing the distance but never falling behind, patient as death itself. Cole worked quickly, efficiently, moving through the rituals of survival honed by decades of necessity. He gathered deadwood, the driest he could find, and built a fire ring from stones. He used aspen where he could find it, wood that burned with less smoke than pine. In country like this, smoke could be spotted for miles. Grace watched him work, still wrapped in his buffalo coat, shivering despite its warmth. She'd been cold for so long now it felt like a permanent condition. "Can I help?" she asked, hating how weak her voice sounded. "Stay by the rocks, out of the wind," Cole said, not looking up from his work. "Your body needs to stop losing heat before anything else matters." He had fire going within 10 minutes, small but steady, built inside a ring of stones that would hold and reflect warmth. Only when it was established did he turn his attention to other necessities. From his saddlebags, he produced a length of thin wire and spent 15 minutes in the failing light, setting snares and rabbit runs he'd spotted on the way in. When he returned, Grace had moved closer to the fire, her face showing the first hint of color since morning. "We can't stay here long," Cole said, checking his rifle. Maybe 4 hours sleep, then we move again before dawn. They'll expect us to hole up for the whole night. Won't they keep tracking in the dark? Grace asked. Not likely. Even the Cullens won't risk laming their horses on unseen rocks in the dark. But come first light, they'll be moving. He pulled a canteen from his saddle, took a long drink, then offered it to Grace. She drank, the water so cold it hurt her teeth, but it was water and she was desperately thirsty. How do you know so much about this, she asked. About running, hiding, surviving? Cole settled against a rock near the fire, rifle across his lap. 1863, during the war, my unit got cut off behind Confederate lines in Tennessee. 23 men, 3 weeks in winter, living off what we could trap or steal. Half of us made it out. He paused, firelight shadowing his face. The ones who lived were the ones who understood that pride kills faster than bullets. You do what you need to do. You eat what you need to eat. You sleep when you can sleep. And you keep moving. Grace absorbed this, understanding that she was hearing lessons purchased with other men's lives. Tell me about the Cullens, she said. What are we really facing? Cole appreciated the question. Fear without information was panic. Fear with understanding was caution, which could be managed. Pete's the older one, 32. Good tracker, learned from Shoshone scouts during the Indian Wars. Methodical. He'll read the sign like you read a book. Jim's younger, 28, more impulsive, more cruel. Together, they've brought in 23 wanted men over 5 years. 18 of those came back alive. He met her eyes. The other 5 resisted. Are we resisting? We're surviving. There's a difference, They fell into silence then, listening to the fire crackle and the wind move through the pines. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled and was answered by another. Grace had never felt more aware of her own mortality, of how thin the line between living and dying in this country. Tell me about Sarah, she said quietly. Your sister. Cole was silent long enough that Grace thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, his voice rough with old pain. Sarah was 5 years younger than me, smart, funny, drew pictures of birds and flowers with charcoal. Pa said that was foolishness, that she needed to learn practical things, but Ma let her draw anyway. He fed another stick into the fire. When she was 19, Pa arranged her marriage to William Crenshaw, a merchant from Laramie. Successful man, 40 years old, respected. None of us knew he had a temper like dynamite with a short fuse. Grace waited, knowing this story didn't end anywhere good. She wrote me letters. At first they seemed normal. Then they got shorter. Then they started having odd gaps, things she'd mention then not explain. I was too young, too stupid, too focused on making my own way to read between the lines. By the time I got home for Christmas in '63, Sarah had been dead 2 months. Walked into the Laramie River in February with stones sewn into her dress pockets. I'm sorry, Grace said, the words inadequate but sincere. Crenshaw told everyone she'd been melancholic, unstable. Most people believed him. But I talked to their neighbor, old Mrs. Patterson. She'd heard things through the walls, shouting, crying, sounds of violence. But nobody intervened because it was between a man and his wife, and the law didn't concern itself with such things. Cole's hands tightened on his rifle. I went to Crenshaw's house, told him I knew what he'd done. He laughed at me, said prove it, said a man has rights over his property, and his wife was his property. What did you do? Nothing. That's what eats at me. I did nothing. I was 23, fresh from war, full of rage but bound by law and custom and my own cowardice. I walked away. And Crenshaw lived another 10 years before a heart attack took him, died in his sleep, peaceful, unpunished. Cole looked at Grace then, and she saw the weight he'd carried for 15 years. So when I heard you this morning, asking for someone to stop it, I heard Sarah, and I swore this time I wouldn't walk away. Grace felt tears freeze on her cheeks. You're not responsible for what happened to her. Tell that to the part of me that wakes up at 3 in the morning seeing her face. He shook his head. Anyway, that's why I did what I did. That's why we're sitting in the cold with killers on our trail. Because I got a second chance to do the right thing and I took it, consequences be damned. They sat in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Grace found herself studying this man who'd risked everything for a stranger. He wasn't handsome in any conventional sense. Too weathered, too hard, carved by years of labor and loss into something more elemental than attractive. But there was strength in him, not just physical, but moral, the kind that didn't bend when tested. Around midnight, one of Cole's snares produced a rabbit. He skinned and gutted it with practiced efficiency, cooked it over the fire on a green stick. They ate in silence, the meat tough but nourishing, splitting it equally despite Grace's protest that he should eat more. "You need strength same as me," Cole said. "Maybe more. You've been through hell today." After eating, Cole taught her something that surprised her. He pulled his Colt revolver, unloaded it, and placed it in her hands. "Feel the weight," he said. "Get comfortable with how it sits in your grip." Grace had never held a gun before. It felt heavy, dangerous, foreign. "Tomorrow or the next day, you might need to use this," Cole said. "I don't like that reality any more than you do, but denying it doesn't change it. So I'm going to teach you the basics. Not enough to make you a gunfighter, just enough that you can protect yourself if I'm not able to." He showed her how to load it, how to cock the hammer, how to aim using the sights. Then he had her practice the motion over and over, unloaded until her hands stopped shaking quite so badly. "The kick will surprise you," he said. "It'll hurt your wrist, but you hold steady and you pull the trigger smooth, not jerky. And you aim center mass. Don't try for a fancy shot. Just aim for the biggest part of whatever you're shooting at." "I don't know if I could actually shoot someone," Grace said. "You won't know until you have to. But knowing how gives you a choice. Not knowing means you're helpless, and you're done being helpless." Something in those words landed deep in Grace's chest. "You're done being helpless." She repeated them silently, testing their weight. They slept in shifts, 2 hours each, huddled close to the fire for warmth. When Cole woke Grace for her watch shift at 3 in the morning, the stars overhead burned cold and bright as ice diamonds. "Keep the fire fed," Cole said. "Wake me if you hear anything that doesn't sound like wind or animals. And Grace, if something happens to me, you ride east. Don't stop. Don't look back. Redemption Creek is the only safety you've got." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Grace said, surprised by how much she meant it. "Probably not tonight," Cole agreed. "But we plan for worst cases, hope for best ones." He was asleep within minutes, that soldier's trick of resting whenever opportunity allowed. Grace sat watch, feeding the fire, listening to the immense silence of the winter mountains. She'd never been alone like this, never been responsible for her own survival in such immediate terms. Boston finishing school hadn't prepared her for a cold that could kill, or men who hunted humans for money. But something was changing in her. The fear was still there, but underneath it, something harder was forming. Anger, yes, but also determination. Also a growing sense that she'd spent 24 years living a life designed by others, performing a role written before she was born, and that maybe this nightmare was also an opportunity. An opportunity to discover who Grace Hartley actually was when all the social expectations and proper behavior and ladylike constraints were stripped away. She looked at Cole sleeping, this man who'd sacrificed his safety for a stranger, and made a silent vow. She wouldn't be dead weight. She'd learn, she'd adapt, she'd survive. And when this was over, she'd never again let anyone make her feel helpless. Dawn came gray and bitter, the temperature at 22 below zero. Cole had them moving before sunrise, cold camp, no fire that might give away their position. They rode hard through country that grew increasingly rough, climbing toward the high pass that separated them from Redemption Creek. By mid-morning, Grace spotted them. "Cole," she said quietly, "behind us, maybe 2 miles." Cole didn't turn to look, didn't need to. "I know, they're pacing us, waiting for us to make a mistake, or the horse to give out." "The horse is tired," Grace said. She could feel it in how the animal moved, the slight hesitation in its gait. "I know that too." Cole's voice stayed calm, but she heard the tension underneath. "We've got maybe another 6 hours before the horse can't carry both of us anymore. So we've got to make a choice." "What choice?" "We can keep running, hope to reach Redemption Creek before they catch us. But if the horse gives out, we're on foot and they're mounted and we die." He paused. "Or we pick our ground, we wait, and we face them on terms we choose instead of terms they force on us." Grace felt ice that had nothing to do with temperature form in her stomach. "You mean fight them?" I mean, survive them. Fighting's just the method. They rode another mile while Grace processed this. Everything in her upbringing, every lesson in proper feminine behavior, recoiled from the idea of vigilance. But everything she'd learned in the last 24 hours said that proper behavior was a luxury purchased with safety, and safety was something she no longer possessed. Where? She asked. Cole allowed himself a small smile. Grace was tougher than she looked. There's a place about 3 miles ahead. Narrows between two rock faces. Good sight lines. High ground. If we set up right, two of us can hold off two of them long enough to make them reconsider the cost of that $500 bounty. And if we can't hold them off, then we make them pay such a price for killing us that they'll remember it the rest of their lives. It wasn't the most encouraging answer, but it was honest, and Grace found she preferred honest to comforting. They reached the Narrows by noon. Cole had been right. A gap between granite outcroppings, maybe 30 yards wide with scattered boulders for cover. Anyone coming through had to cross open ground under observation from the high side. Cole positioned them carefully. Grace behind a boulder with his rifle, Cole lower down with his revolver and his knife. He showed her how to rest the rifle barrel on the rock, how to sight along it, how to breathe steady before squeezing the trigger. You've got 15 rounds, he said. Make them count. Don't shoot unless you've got a clear target. And Grace, if it comes to it, if they get past me, you put that barrel to your own head and you pull the trigger. You understand? Don't let them take you alive back to Raymond. Grace's hands shook, but she nodded. She understood. Death was preferable to what Raymond would do to her as punishment for this defiance. They waited. The wind blew. The cold deepened. And then, finally, they came. Pete and Jim Cullen rode into view an hour later, their horses picking careful paths through the snow. They stopped at the entrance to the Narrows, studying the terrain with the wariness of men who'd survived by being cautious. Pete was the taller of the two, lean as a whip, with a long scar running down his left cheek. Jim was shorter, broader, with small eyes that never stopped moving. Both wore heavy coats and had rifles across their saddles. "Branson!" Pete called out, his voice echoing between the rock walls. "We know you're in there. No point hiding." Cole didn't answer. Sometimes silence said more than words. "Raymond's offering $500, Pete continued. "Dead or alive for the girl, but we're willing to negotiate. You walk away now, we got no quarrel with you. This is just business." "Business," Cole said, finally speaking, his voice carrying clearly. "That what you call hunting a woman who's done you no harm?" "We call it earning a living," Jim shouted back, his voice rougher than his brother's. "Same as any man. Now you can make this easy or hard, but the result's the same. We're taking her back." Cole's response was to fire a single shot that kicked up snow 2 feet in front of Pete's horse. The animal reared, nearly throwing its rider. "Next one won't be a warning," Cole said. The Cullens exchanged glances, then dismounted, leading their horses back behind cover. They'd fought enough to recognize a prepared position when they saw one. What followed was a standoff that stretched through the afternoon. Occasionally, one of the Cullens would try to work around the flanks, probing for weakness. Each time, Cole would fire a shot that came close enough to drive them back. He was rationing ammunition, Grace realized, making every shot count, forcing them to respect his accuracy. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Jim Cullen tried something different. He sprinted across open ground, zigzagging, making himself a hard target. He almost made it to cover before Cole's bullet took him in the thigh. Jim went down screaming, clutching his leg as blood spread dark against the snow. Pete dragged his brother back behind the rocks, shouting curses that echoed off stone. "You're going to pay for that, Branson," Pete yelled. "That's my brother's blood." "Then maybe you should think about whose blood you're willing to spill for money," Cole called back. Silence fell then, broken only by Jim's groans. Grace could hear the brothers arguing, heated whispers that didn't quite carry clearly, but spoke of disagreement. Finally, Pete's voice rang out again. "All right, you win this round. We're pulling back, but this ain't over. Raymond wants her bad, and $500 will bring more hunters than just us." "Let them come," Cole said. "Result will be the same." They heard the Cullens mounting up, heard hoofbeats receding. Cole waited a full 30 minutes before moving from his position, rifle ready, eyes scanning for tricks. Only when he was certain they had truly gone did he relax slightly. "We hurt them," he said, climbing up to where Grace waited. "Hurt them enough that they'll think twice about the swoosh versus the profit." But Pete was right. Raymond won't stop. He'll send others. Grace lowered the rifle, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. She hadn't fired a shot, but she'd been ready to, and that knowledge changed something in her understanding of herself. "How far to Redemption Creek?" she asked. 15 miles. If we ride through the night, we can make it by dawn." Cole studied her face. "You did good today. Stayed calm. Didn't panic. That's harder than most people think." "I was terrified," Grace admitted. "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing what needs doing anyway." He gathered their supplies. "Come on, we've got miles to cover and limited darkness to cover them in." They rode through the night, pushing the horse as hard as they dared, stopping only briefly to let it rest and drink from snowmelt. Grace dozed in the saddle, Cole's arms around her, keeping her from falling. Her exhaustion so complete that even terror couldn't keep her awake. She woke to pale dawn light and the sight of a town in the valley below. Redemption Creek, smaller than Fort Bridger, maybe 150 souls, but the smoke from chimneys and the sound of a blacksmith's hammer spoke of civilization, safety, law. They were a mile from town when riders appeared. Grace tensed, but Cole's hand on her arm was reassuring. "That's Marshal Hayes," Jimmy said. "I recognize him from years back." Marshal William Hayes rode up with 4 deputies, all armed, all looking professional and alert. Hayes himself was 55, with a gray beard and eyes that had seen enough of human nature to be neither surprised nor easily impressed. "Cole Branson," Hayes said. "Been a long time." "Marshal," Cole acknowledged, "this is Grace Hartley. She needs protection, and she needs to file charges against Raymond Blackwell of Fort Bridger." Hayes studied Grace with the careful attention of a man trained to read truth from lies. What he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded. "We got word from Doc Morrison 2 days ago. Telegraph came through, said to watch for you." He included some interesting medical documentation about Blackwell's deceased wives. Hayes's expression hardened. "Miss Hartley, you're safe now, and you, Cole, you've stirred up a hornet's nest, but maybe for good reason. Let's get you both inside where it's warm and we can sort through this properly." They rode into Redemption Creek as the town woke to morning. People stopped to stare, but there was curiosity in their looks, not judgment. Grace felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since yesterday morning. Not safety, not yet, but the possibility of safety. Marshal Hayes took them to a boarding house run by a widow named Maggie O'Brien, a woman of 58 with kind eyes and capable hands. She took one look at Grace and immediately ran a hot bath, found clean clothes, and served breakfast that tasted better than anything Grace had ever eaten in Boston's finest restaurants. Cole met with Marshal Hayes while Grace bathed and rested. They talked for 2 hours, going over everything that had happened, every detail of the case against Raymond. Hayes took notes in careful handwriting, asked sharp questions, and by the end seemed satisfied. "I can hold Blackwell for investigation," Hayes said. "Doc Morrison's evidence about arsenic poisoning is compelling, and your testimony about the illegal punishment adds weight. But Cole, I'm going to be honest. Blackwell's got money and the lawyers. Making charges stick will be hard." "Then we find a way to make them stick," Cole said flatly. "Because if we don't, Grace goes back to Fort Bridger and I probably hang for kidnapping." "No one's hanging anybody," Hayes said, "but we need more. We need either a witness who'll testify to seeing Blackwell commit murder, or we need a confession. Either way, we need something ironclad." Cole nodded slowly, an idea forming. "What if we got both?" Later that afternoon, rested and fed and dressed in borrowed clothes that actually fit, Grace sat with Cole and Hayes around a table in Hayes' office. Cole laid out his plan, and the more he talked, the more Grace understood both its brilliance and its risk. "You want me to visit Raymond in his cell," Grace said slowly. "You want me to face him, alone, and try to get him to confess." "Not alone," Cole corrected. "I'll be right outside. And Marshal Hayes will be listening through the door. If he says anything incriminating, we've got him. And if he doesn't confess, if he just threatens me, then we've lost nothing except some time." Hayes said. Miss Hartley, I won't force you to do this. Lord knows you've been through enough. But Cole's right. This might be our best chance to put Blackwell away for good. Grace looked between them, these two men who'd become her unlikely allies. Everything in her wanted to refuse, wanted to never see Raymond Blackwell's cold eyes again. But she thought about the two women who'd been his wives before, about the silent graves they rested in, about the justice they'd been denied. I'll do it, she said, but Cole stays close. I need to know he's there. Right outside the door, Cole promised. You get scared, you just say stop, and we end it. The next morning, Marshal Hayes arrested Raymond Blackwell as he rode into Redemption Creek with Sheriff Wilson and 3 hired men. The arrest was clean, professional, backed by enough armed deputies that even Raymond's men didn't try anything stupid. Raymond's face when he saw Grace standing beside Cole went from surprise to fury to cold calculation in the space of 2 heartbeats. This is a mistake, Marshal, Raymond said, his voice controlled despite the handcuffs. I'm a respected businessman. These charges are fabricated by criminals trying to cover their own crimes. We'll let a judge sort that out, Hayes said. Until then, you're my guest. They locked Raymond in the town's small jail, a stone building that had held everyone from claim jumpers to horse thieves in its time. Sheriff Wilson was placed in a separate cell, his badge confiscated, his cooperation in Raymond's schemes now a matter of official investigation. That afternoon, Grace walked into Raymond's cell with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Cole stood just outside, hand on his gun, eyes never leaving the door. Marshal Hayes pressed his ear to a crack in the wall, listening, taking notes. Raymond sat on the wooden bunk, looking somehow diminished in his prison clothes, but no less dangerous. His eyes tracked Grace as she entered, cold and assessing. Grace, he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. My daughter, finally come to see reason. I'm not your daughter, Grace said, forcing her voice steady. Blood doesn't make family. But blood makes power, Raymond countered. And I have power, money, land, influence. These charges won't stick. My lawyers are already on their way from Denver. I'll be free within a week, and when I am, there will be consequences for everyone who thought they could stand against me. Is that what you did to Helen and Martha? Grace asked, using his dead wives' names deliberately. Made them face consequences? Something flickered in Raymond's eyes. Annoyance, impatience. Helen couldn't give me children. Useless. Martha gave me a son who died at 6 months. She became difficult, unstable. I simply helped them both find peace. The admission was so casual, so matter-of-fact that Grace felt nausea rise in her throat. But she pushed on, needing him to say more. How, she asked. How did you help them find peace? Raymond smiled, cold as winter ice. Arsenic, tasteless in tea, painless if administered slowly. They simply went to sleep one night and didn't wake up. Peaceful, dignified, much better than the alternative. And what was the alternative? Living with me while being useless, Raymond said. Taking up space, consuming resources. I'm a practical man, Grace. I deal with problems efficiently. Grace felt her hands shaking, fought to control them. And now you want me to be wife number 3? No, Raymond said, standing, moving closer despite the handcuffs. I want you to be my heir. I'm 45. I need a son to pass my empire to. If you marry me, give me that son, I'll give you everything. Power, security, respect. And if I refuse? Raymond's smile vanished. Then I'll kill you, and I'll kill Branson. I have men inside this marshal's office. They'll poison your food within 3 days. You'll die slowly, painfully, and everyone will think it was some illness you caught in the cold. And afterward, I'll walk free, find another woman, and continue exactly as I have been. The door burst open. Cole entered with gun drawn, followed by Marshal Hayes. Raymond's face shifted from confidence to shock to rage in rapid sequence. Raymond Blackwell, Hayes said formally, you just confessed to 2 murders in front of witnesses. Anything else you say can be used against you in court. You can't use that, Raymond snarled. It's entrapment. It's a confession, Hayes corrected, given freely. Miss Hartley came to visit you of her own accord. You chose to tell her the truth. Now you get to live with the consequences. But Raymond wasn't done. In a move that surprised everyone, he lunged forward despite the handcuffs, going for Grace with murder in his eyes. Cole moved faster, intercepting him, driving a fist into Raymond's stomach that doubled him over. Raymond collapsed to the floor, gasping, all his dignity and power reduced to a man struggling to breathe. "Touch her again," Cole said quietly. "And confession or not, I'll kill you myself." Marshal Hayes called for deputies, and Raymond was dragged back to his cell, shouting threats that grew increasingly desperate as the reality of his situation became clear. Outside in the winter sunshine, Grace collapsed against a wall, shaking. Cole stood beside her, not touching but present, giving her space to process what she'd just been through. "You did it," he said finally. "You faced him and you got the truth. That took more courage than most people ever have to find." "I don't feel brave," Grace said. "I feel sick." "That's normal. You just confronted evil and survived it. Being sick means you're human, not weak." Over the next week, the full scope of Raymond's crimes unraveled. Deputy Samuel Cross offered immunity in exchange for testimony, revealed that Raymond had ordered him to poison Cole and Grace's food. He confessed to taking $200 from Raymond for the job and admitted that Sheriff Wilson had been on Raymond's payroll for years. Further investigation revealed that Wilson had covered up a killing in 1875, shooting an innocent man to protect Raymond from a witness to fraud. The house of cards that Raymond had built through intimidation and bribery collapsed, and with it, the fear that had kept Fort Bridger silent for so long. Thomas Hartley, Grace's father, was brought to Redemption Creek for questioning. The meeting between father and daughter was brief and painful. Thomas looked 20 years older, bent with guilt and shame. "Grace," he said, tears in his eyes, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The gambling, the debt. I couldn't think straight. I thought I could control it, thought I could fix it, and then Raymond had me trapped, and I couldn't see any way out except to sacrifice you. I'm a coward. I'm a failure, and I understand if you never forgive me." Grace looked at this man who'd given her life, then nearly taken it away. She felt anger, yes, but also pity. He'd been weak where he should have been strong, but he was still her father. "I don't forgive you," she said finally. "Not yet, maybe not ever, but I don't hate you. You're sick, Father. The gambling is a sickness, and you need help for it." Thomas nodded, unable to meet her eyes. He pleaded guilty to assault and to conspiracy, accepting a 5-year sentence with the understanding that Grace could have pushed for much worse. 3 weeks after Grace's ordeal in Fort Bridger, Raymond Blackwell stood trial in Cheyenne, Wyoming territory. The courtroom was packed. Judge Isaac Carter, 68 years old and known for his fairness, presided. The evidence was overwhelming. Doc Morrison's medical testimony about arsenic poisoning, Grace's account of Raymond's confession, Deputy Cross's admission of conspiracy to murder, financial records showing how Raymond had profited from his wife's deaths. Raymond's lawyer, a slick Denver attorney named Edward Crane, tried every legal maneuver available, but the facts were undeniable. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes before returning with verdicts. Guilty of first-degree murder, twice. Guilty of attempted murder, twice. Guilty of conspiracy, extortion, and bribery. Judge Carter sentenced Raymond to death by hanging. Sheriff Wilson received 20 years for murder and corruption. Deputy Cross got 10 years for conspiracy to commit murder. When they led Raymond from the courtroom, he looked at Grace one final time. "You'll regret this," he said. "Blood calls to blood. You betrayed your own father." Grace stood straight, meeting his eyes without flinching. "You were never my father. A father protects. You only possessed." Cole Branson, a stranger with no blood tie to me, showed me what real protection looks like, what real strength looks like, and it looks nothing like you. Raymond was hanged on a cold February morning. Grace didn't attend. Neither did Cole. Some endings didn't require witnessing to be real. Back in the boarding house that night, Cole and Grace sat in the common room, fire burning low, the weight of 3 weeks finally settling on their shoulders. "What will you do now?" Cole asked. "Fort Bridger's not safe for you. Your father's in prison. The bank's being managed by a committee. You're free, Grace. Completely free. So what do you want?" Grace had been thinking about this question for days. She had money, inherited from her mother, enough to start over anywhere. Boston, San Francisco, Denver. She could disappear into a city, become someone new, leave all this behind. But she found she didn't want to disappear. She wanted something else, something she'd never had before. I want to learn, she said. I want to learn how to survive. Really survive. Not just in ballrooms and tea rooms, but in the real world. I want to learn what you know. How to build fire, how to track, how to shoot straight, how to live on my own terms. She looked at him directly. I want you to teach me. Cole studied her face, seeing the determination there, the fundamental change that trauma and survival had worked in her character. That's a hard life, he said. Cold winters, hard work, no guarantees of comfort. I've had comfort, Grace said. It nearly killed me. I'll take hard work over comfortable captivity any day. Cole allowed himself a small smile. I've got a ranch, 120 acres. Not much, but it's mine and it's paid for. I could use a partner, someone who knows how to manage books and money, because I'm terrible at that part. Someone willing to learn the rest. Room and board, equal share of profits. No obligations beyond honest work. No obligations, Grace repeated. She extended her hand. Partners, then. Cole shook it, his grip firm, respectful. Partners. In the 1918 ranch house, old Cole paused in his story, watching Jake's face by firelight. The boy sat transfixed, completely absorbed in a story that had happened before his parents were born. So she stayed, Jake said. She became your partner. She did, Cole confirmed. For 31 years. Grace ran the business side while I ran the cattle side. We expanded to 200 acres. Built a good life. Not what she'd been raised for, not what anyone expected, but good, real, built on respect instead of obligation. Did you love her? Jake asked. Cole considered the question carefully. Not the way you mean, not romantic love. But there's more than one kind of love in this world, boy. There's the love between people who've bled together, fought together, survived together, the love of mutual respect and shared purpose. Grace and I had that. And sometimes I think that's stronger than romantic love because it's built on choice, not just feeling. Well, Jake nodded slowly, processing this. What happened to her? Influenza, 1910. She fought it hard, but some battles you can't win. Cole's voice roughened slightly. She wrote me a letter before she died. Told me I'd saved her life that morning in Fort Bridger. But more than that, I'd given her the chance to live a life that was actually hers. That's all any of us really want, Jake. A life that belongs to us, a life we chose. The fire burned lower. Snow continued to fall outside. And somewhere in the space between past and present, between story and truth, Jake understood something profound about courage and choice and the ways people save each other. Is that the end? He asked. Almost, Cole said. There's one more part. The part where we understand what all that sacrifice and struggle meant. The part about legacy, about what we leave behind when we're gone. Pour some more wood on that fire, boy. This last part's important. The fire had settled into steady warmth, casting long shadows across the 1918 ranch house walls. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind that particular silence that comes after heavy snow, when the world feels muffled and new. Jake added the last log from the evening stack, watching sparks climb toward the chimney like memories seeking escape. Cole Branson, 78 years old and still straight-backed, despite the weight of decades, reached into the wooden chest beside his chair. His movements were deliberate, careful, the motions of a man who understood that some objects carried more than physical weight. The ending, Cole said, his weathered hands closing around something inside the chest, is never just about how a story concludes. It's about what that conclusion means, what it teaches, what it leaves behind for those who come after. He withdrew 3 items, placing them on the table between himself and Jake, with the reverence usually reserved for holy relics. A coil of rope, old and frayed, cut clean through at one end, a letter yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible, and a photograph, sepia tone, showing a woman standing beside a fence line, her posture straight, her eyes looking directly at the camera with something that might have been defiance or might have been simple, hard-won confidence. These, Cole said, are what remains when the story's told and the people in it are gone. Physical proof that it all happened, that choices were made, that lives were changed, that courage, when it's real, leaves marks on the world. Jake leaned forward, studying the objects with the intensity of youth encountering history made tangible. The rope, he said, that's the one you cut? The very one, Cole confirmed. Kept it all these years, not as a trophy, as a reminder. Of what? Of how thin the line is between helping and standing by. Of how one decision, one moment of choosing action over comfort can change everything. Cole picked up the rope, turning it in his gnarled hands. This rope would have killed Grace eventually. Not quickly, but cold and humiliation and despair, they killed just as sure as bullets. Sometimes slower, sometimes worse. When I cut this, I wasn't just freeing her from a physical binding. I was giving her back something more important, the right to choose her own path. He set the rope down, picked up the letter. Grace wrote this in 109. She was 44 years old. Influenza was working through the territory. She knew she might not survive. So she wrote this, sealed it, told me only to read it if she died. What does it say? Jake asked quietly. Cole's voice, when he read, carried the weight of words written by someone facing mortality with clear eyes. Cole, if you're reading this, I've gone where winter never comes and ropes never bind. I want you to know something I never said clearly enough while living. You saved my life that December morning in 1878, yes. But more than that, you gave me permission to save myself. You showed me that strength isn't about never being afraid or never needing help. It's about standing up after you've been knocked down. It's about choosing courage even when every instinct screams for safety. You taught me how to live, not just survive. How to be my own woman in a world that wanted to own me. For that gift, for that example, I am eternally grateful. The life I lived after Fort Bridger was mine, truly mine. And that's the greatest freedom anyone can know. Don't grieve for me. I lived more fully in 30 years with you than I would have in 80 years of proper Boston society. Remember me as I was at the end, strong and certain, not as I was at the beginning, broken and afraid. Your friend and partner, Grace Margaret Hartley. Silence filled the room after Cole finished reading. Jake wiped at his eyes, not embarrassed by the tears, understanding that some stories earned them. Cole carefully folded the letter, placed it back with the other items. Then he picked up the photograph, studying it as if seeing it for the first time despite having looked at it 10,000 times over the years. This was taken in spring of 1879, he said, 4 months after everything happened. Look at her eyes, Jake. Really look. Jake studied the photograph. The woman in it, Grace, stood beside a fence post with her hand resting on weathered wood. She wore simple working clothes, not the fine dresses of her former life. Her hair was pulled back practically, but it was her eyes that arrested attention. They looked directly at the camera with an expression that was neither smile nor frown, but something more fundamental. Presence. Reality. The look of someone who knew exactly who they were and required no permission to be it. She looked strong, Jake said. She was, Cole agreed, but not the way she started. The Grace who was dragged through Fort Bridger was strong in potential. The Grace in this photograph was strong in practice. She'd learned. She'd survived. She'd changed from someone who had strength to someone who was strength. There's a difference, and it matters. He set the photograph down gently. Now I'll tell you the rest. The part that happened after the trial. The part about building something from the ashes of what was destroyed. Wyoming Territory, spring 1879. The snow had finally melted from the high country, revealing the brown and green promise of renewal. Cole's ranch, 120 acres of grassland and timber in the foothills outside Redemption Creek, emerged from winter looking weathered but intact. Fences needed mending. The barn roof needed patching. The stock had survived but looked lean. It was, in short, exactly the kind of hard work that made strong people stronger. Grace stood in the ranch yard, looking at the main house for the first time. It wasn't large, single story, 3 rooms, built from lodgepole pine logs chinked with mud and moss. The windows were small, designed to do more for keeping heat in than letting light through. The roof was sod, good for insulation but prone to leaking. It's not much, Cole said, reading the assessment in her face. It's honest, Grace replied, and it's real. That's more than I had in Fort Bridger. They'd spent the 6 weeks since Raymond's trial in Redemption Creek, waiting for legal matters to resolve, waiting for Grace's inheritance from her mother to clear probate, waiting for winter to release its grip. Now, finally, they stood at the beginning of what came next. Partnership means equal work, Cole said, laying out terms with the same straightforward honesty that characterized everything about him. I'll teach you ranching. You already know bookkeeping and letters better than me. We split profits 50-50. Neither of us owns the other. Neither of us has authority over the other. We make decisions together and we live with them together. Clear? Clear, Grace said. She extended her hand. When do we start? Now. The first month was brutal. Grace had to unlearn 24 years of conditioning that said women didn't do physical labor, didn't get dirty, didn't sweat or strain or develop calluses. Her hands, soft from years of piano playing and needlework, blistered within days. Her back ached from bending to mend fence. Her shoulders burned from learning to throw rope. But she didn't complain. Not once, because every blister, every ache, every moment of exhaustion was proof that she was building something. Not for anyone else, not to meet anyone's expectations, but for herself, building a life that belonged to her. Cole proved to be a patient teacher, showing rather than telling, correcting without criticizing. He taught her how to read weather signs, the subtle shifts in wind and cloud that meant rain or snow or clear skies. He taught her how to evaluate cattle, seeing past surface condition to underlying health. He taught her how to ride not like a lady on a gentle mare, but like a rancher who might need to cover 20 miles in difficult terrain. In return, Grace transformed the ranch's business side. She set up proper accounting books, tracking every penny spent and earned. She negotiated better prices with merchants in Redemption Creek by understanding market rates and refusing to be cheated. She wrote letters to cattle buyers in Cheyenne and Denver, establishing relationships that would pay dividends for years. By summer, the ranch was functioning smoothly, not prosperously yet, but efficiently, each of them contributing their strengths, covering each other's weaknesses. They fell into rhythms: morning coffee before dawn, work until exhaustion, simple dinners eaten in comfortable silence, early sleep because mornings helped regardless of readiness. One evening in July, as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Grace asked a question she'd been holding for months. Cole, do you ever regret it? Giving up your solitary life for this partnership? For the complications I brought? Cole considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. I was alone for 3 years after Emma died. Thought that was what I wanted. Thought solitude was safety. But solitude and isolation aren't the same thing. One is chosen, the other is imposed. I was isolated, not solitary. I was hiding. He looked at her directly. You didn't complicate my life, Grace. You reminded me I still had one. There's a difference. I'm glad, Grace said softly, because you did the same for me. Before that morning in Fort Bridger, I thought my life was over, that I had no choices, no power, no future except what others designed for me. You showed me I was wrong. They sat in silence after that, watching night replace day, comfortable with each other in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with respect earned through shared struggle. But peace, even hard-won peace, never lasts uninterrupted in this world. In August, a rider arrived from Fort Bridger. Not a threat, not violence, just a young lawyer named Samuel Hendricks, nephew of the town's reverend, carrying documents and uncomfortable news. Raymond Blackwell had been executed in June, but before his death, he'd made arrangements. Specifically, he'd altered his will to leave everything to Grace, his beloved daughter, in what the lawyer described as an act of paternal love and forgiveness. The estate was substantial. 40,000 acres of land, holdings in 3 mining operations, partnership shares in the Fort Bridger Bank, altogether worth something close to $100,000, an almost incomprehensible fortune. Grace read the documents in silence, her face unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no joy, no excitement, only a kind of tired understanding. This isn't love, she said. This is control from beyond the grave. He's trying to buy forgiveness, trying to rewrite history so people remember him as a generous father instead of a murderer. He's trying to own me even in death. Cole, standing beside her, understood immediately. You don't have to accept it. Can I refuse? Lawyer Hendricks cleared his throat uncomfortably. Technically, you can refuse the bequest, but I should inform you that if you do, the estate passes to Raymond's business partners, some of whom are, shall we say, of questionable character. They would likely use that wealth to continue the kinds of practices Raymond engaged in. Exploitation, intimidation, the things you fought against. Grace closed her eyes, feeling the trap even in victory. Accept, and she became complicit in Raymond's legacy, his wealth built on the graves of women he had murdered. Refuse, and that wealth would fuel further injustice, further suffering. There's a third option, Cole said quietly. Accept it, then transform it. Use that money to undo what Raymond did with it. Fund things he would have hated. Help people he would have exploited. Turn his legacy into the opposite of what he intended. Grace opened her eyes, looking at Cole with dawning understanding. That's brilliant, and it's exactly the kind of revenge he couldn't defend against because he's already dead. Over the next 6 months, Grace systematically dismantled and rebuilt Raymond Blackwell's empire. She sold the mining operations to workers' cooperatives, giving the men who'd labored in them ownership stakes. She donated 10,000 acres to the territorial government for a public park. She used another 20,000 acres to establish homesteads for families who couldn't afford land, selling to them at cost with generous payment terms. The Fort Bridger Bank was restructured with community oversight, its lending practices reformed to prevent the kind of predatory behavior Raymond had practiced. Grace endowed a scholarship fund for young women seeking education, specifically those from families that couldn't afford to send daughters to school. By spring of 1880, Raymond's fortune had been transformed from an instrument of control into a foundation for opportunity. And Grace, now one of the wealthiest women in Wyoming Territory on paper, lived exactly as she had before, working the ranch, building calluses, living the life she'd chosen. But wealth, even wealth distributed with good intentions, drew attention, some of it welcome, some decidedly not. In June, a delegation arrived from Fort Bridger. Thomas Hartley, Grace's father, had been released early from prison for good behavior and failing health. Now 63 years old and broken by imprisonment and guilt, he'd come to see his daughter one final time. Cole offered to stay when Thomas arrived, but Grace asked for privacy. This is something I need to do alone, she said. Face him myself, finish what started. Thomas Hartley barely resembled the man who'd stood on the bank porch watching his daughter drag through snow. Prison had carved years from his life, but added decades to his appearance. His hair had gone white. His hands shook constantly. His eyes carried the particular emptiness that comes from knowing you've destroyed the thing you should have protected most. Grace, he said, voice thin as winter ice. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I came to say goodbye. The doctors tell me I have maybe 6 months. Consumption. I wanted to see you once more. To tell you that every day in prison, I thought about what I did, what I let happen. And I wanted you to know that if I could trade places with you, if I could take back that morning and endure it myself, I would. Grace studied this broken man who'd given her life, then nearly taken it away. She felt anger, yes, that would probably never fully disappear. But she also felt something else. Pity. Understanding that weakness, not malice, had been his sin. That he'd been trapped by his own failures as surely as she'd been trapped by that rope. I don't forgive you, Grace said finally. I don't know if I ever will. What you did was unforgivable. But I don't hate you anymore. Hate requires energy I'd rather spend on building than destroying. She paused, choosing words carefully. You can stay for dinner. You can meet my partner. See what I've built from the ruins of what you tried to make me. And then you can go, knowing that I survived, that I'm stronger than you ever imagined, that I'm free in ways you never allowed yourself to be. Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. Thank you. That's more than I deserve. They shared one meal, strained and uncomfortable, but honest. Thomas asked about the ranch, about Grace's life, about her plans. She answered truthfully, neither hiding her success nor flaunting it. Cole remained mostly silent, offering respect through presence, but not inserting himself into a conversation that belonged to father and daughter. When Thomas left the next morning, he shook Cole's hand. "Take care of her," he said. "She takes care of herself," Cole replied. "I just have the privilege of standing beside her while she does." Thomas managed a weak smile. "Then you're luckier than you know." He died 3 months later. Grace attended the funeral in Fort Bridger, standing in the small cemetery where her mother also rested. She didn't cry, but she did place flowers on both graves. Acknowledgement that love and betrayal can coexist, that people are more complicated than simple judgments allow. The years passed. The ranch prospered. Grace and Cole expanded their holdings carefully, never overreaching, never risking the stability they'd built. By 1885, they ran 200 acres and 300 head of cattle. They'd hired 2 ranch hands, young men who worked hard and appreciated honest wages and fair treatment. Grace had become something of a legend in the territory. The woman who'd survived Raymond Blackwell. The woman who'd transformed his fortune into community benefit. The woman who'd chosen ranching over society balls and succeeded at it. People spoke of her with respect, sometimes with awe, occasionally with resentment from those who preferred women to stay in prescribed roles. She didn't care about any of it. She cared about the work, about the land, about building something that would outlast her. In 1890, Wyoming became a state, the 44th admitted to the Union. It entered with something remarkable. Women's suffrage already established. Women could vote, own property independently, serve on juries. Grace and Cole celebrated by riding to Cheyenne to cast ballots in the first state election. Grace's vote equal to any man's, legal and recognized. "Your sister would have loved this," Grace said as they rode home. "She would have," Cole agreed. "Sarah died in a world that saw women as property. You're living in one that's starting, finally, to see them as people. It's not perfect, it's not complete, but it's progress." "Progress purchased with blood," Grace said quietly. "With Sarah's blood, with Helen and Martha's blood, with the suffering of every woman who died because the world wouldn't protect them." "Which is why it matters," Cole said. "Why we keep building, keep fighting, keep making it better for those who come after." Legacy isn't about what we accomplish in our lifetimes. It's about what we make possible for future generations. The years continued their inexorable march. Cole's hair went from black to gray to white. Grace's hands, once soft, became as weathered and capable as any rancher's. They aged together not as lovers but as partners, as friends, as 2 people who'd faced winter and survived and learned from it. In 1900, Grace established something she'd been planning for a decade, the Hartley Foundation for Women's Independence. Funded by what remained of Raymond's fortune and by profits from the ranch, it provided loans to women starting businesses, education funds for girls, and legal assistance for women trapped in situations like the one Grace had faced 22 years earlier. "I can't save Sarah," Grace told Cole when the foundation opened. "I can't save Helen or Martha. But maybe if we do this right, we can save others. We can make sure that when women cry for help, someone answers." Cole, now 58 and still strong but feeling the weight of years, understood. That's the best revenge anyone could ask for, turning suffering into salvation for others. Raymond tried to destroy you. Instead, you used his own resources to build the opposite of everything he stood for. By 1910, the Hartley Foundation had helped more than 200 women. Some had started businesses. Some had escaped violent marriages. Some had gotten educations that opened doors previously locked. Every one of them represented a small victory against the forces that had once tried to break Grace. But time, which spares no one, was running out. The influenza epidemic that swept through Wyoming in 1910 took Grace on a cold November night. She'd been sick for a week, refusing to slow down until her body simply gave out. Cole sat beside her bed in the ranch house they'd shared for 31 years, holding her hand, watching her fight with the same determination she'd brought to everything else in her life. "Cole," she whispered, her voice rough from coughing, "don't grieve too long. Promise me." "Can't promise that," Cole said honestly. "But I promise not to let grief stop me from living." "That good enough?" Grace smiled weakly. "It'll do." She paused, gathering strength. "There's a letter in my desk for you. Read it when I'm gone." Grace, promise. I promise. She died 2 hours later, peacefully, surrounded by the life she'd built. Cole kept his promise, both about grieving and about living. He read her letter, kept it with the rope and the photograph, and continued running the ranch and the foundation, honoring her memory by continuing the work she'd started. In the 1918 ranch house, Jake sat in silence after Cole finished speaking. The fire had burned low again, but neither moved to feed it. Some moments required stillness. She died 8 years ago, Jake said finally, but you still miss her. Every day, Cole admitted, but I don't regret a moment of those 31 years. Not the hard work, not the struggles, not even the ending, because the ending was part of the story and the story was true. That matters more than people think. He gathered the three objects, the rope and letter and photograph, and held them out to Jake. These are yours now, Cole said. Part of your inheritance. Not money, though there'll be some of that too. But these are more important. These are reminders, lessons, proof that one person's courage can change everything. Jake took them reverently, understanding their weight. What am I supposed to do with them? Remember, Cole said simply. Remember that your great-uncle once stood at a crossroads where he could have walked away, could have chosen safety over justice, comfort over courage. Remember that he chose to act. Remember that a woman named Grace refused to stay broken, chose to rebuild herself, and use the resources meant to control her to free others instead. Remember these things, and when you face your own crossroads, when your own moment comes to choose between standing by and standing up, you'll know what to do. Tell me about the rope again, Jake said. Why keep it all these years? Cole picked up the severed rope, turning it in the firelight. Because this rope represents a choice. When I cut it, I freed Grace from literal binding. But more than that, I cut through the belief that some people can be owned, that power and money and custom give anyone the right to treat others as property. Every time I looked at this rope over the years, I remembered that morning. Remembered the feel of the knife cutting through. Remembered Grace's face when she realized someone had finally answered her call for help. And I remembered why it mattered. He handed the rope to Jake. This is 40 years old. The hemp is rotting. The fibers are coming apart. In another decade, it'll probably fall to dust. But the lesson it teaches doesn't decay. The lesson is permanent. Some things are wrong regardless of law or custom. And when we see wrong being done, we have an obligation to act. Not because it's easy, not because it's safe, but because doing nothing makes us complicit. Jake nodded slowly, understanding settling into him the way important truths do, not all at once, but gradually, building layer by layer. The letter, Cole continued, picking it up. This teaches something else. It teaches that salvation isn't just about being saved. It's about what you do with that salvation afterward. Grace could have taken her freedom and lived quietly, gratefully, trying not to make waves. Instead, she used it to build, to help others, to transform suffering into strength. That's legacy. That's how we honor the sacrifices that give us opportunity. He handed the letter to Jake, who held it as carefully as sacred text. And the photograph, Cole said, picking up the final item, this teaches the most important lesson of all. Look at her eyes. Really look. What do you see? Jake studied the faded image. I see someone who knows who they are. Exactly, Cole said. That's the greatest freedom any of us can achieve. Not freedom from hardship, not freedom from struggle, but freedom to be ourselves without apology or pretense. Grace found that freedom. She fought for it. She earned it. And she lived it fully for 31 years. That's what I want you to remember most. Not the dramatic rescue, not the trial, not even the foundation. Remember that she became herself, fully and completely, and that becoming was the real victory. The photograph joined the rope and letter in Jake's hands, three objects that together told a story bigger than their physical form. What happens to the foundation? Jake asked. To Grace's work? It continues, Cole said. I've been running it since she died. When I'm gone, it passes to trustees who share the vision, including you if you're willing. The work doesn't end just because the founders are gone. That's what legacy means. Building something that outlasts you, creating change that compounds over generations. Jake looked at the objects in his hands, then at his great-uncle, seeing him properly for the first time, not just as an old man telling stories, but as someone who'd lived those stories, who'd made choices that echoed through decades, who'd built something worth remembering. I'm willing, Jake said. I want to help. I want to be part of it. Cole smiled, and for a moment 40 years fell away, and Jake could see the man who'd cut that rope, who'd faced down bounty hunters and corrupt lawmen, who'd chosen courage when comfort was available. Good, Cole said. Then you understand what I've been trying to teach you tonight. That history isn't just about what happened. It's about what we learn from what happened. It's about carrying forward the lessons, the values, the determination of those who came before. Sarah died because no one acted. Grace lived because someone did. And now you know the story, you carry the responsibility. When your moment comes, when you see injustice and have the choice to act or walk away, you'll remember this rope, this letter, this photograph, and you'll know what to do. Outside, the storm had completely passed. Stars emerged in a clear black sky, sharp and bright as broken glass. The temperature was dropping again, the way it does on clear winter nights. But inside the ranch house, fire and story kept the cold at bay. The ending, Cole said, returning to where he'd started, isn't just about how stories conclude. It's about what they set in motion, about what they teach, about what they make possible. He looked at Jake directly. Grace and I didn't have children, but we had this ranch. We had the foundation. We had the lives we touched and changed, and now we have you, carrying forward what we started. That's legacy. That's immortality. Not in living forever, but in building something that does. Jake carefully wrapped the three objects in cloth, treating them with the reverence they deserved. I'll take care of them, he promised. I'll remember. I know you will, Cole said. And someday, when you're old and gray like me, when you're sitting by a fire with someone young and eager, you'll tell them this story. You'll show them these objects. And you'll pass on what I'm passing to you. That's how truth survives. Not through writing it down, though that helps, but through telling it, living it, breathing it into the next generation. The fire burned down to embers. The night deepened. And in that ranch house in Wyoming, 40 years and uncounted miles from where it all began, a story reached its end and its beginning simultaneously. Because some stories don't conclude. They continue. They grow. They transform with each telling, each listener, each person who takes up the lessons and carries them forward. Cole stood, joints protesting years of hard work, and walked to the window. Outside, snow covered everything in pristine white, unmarked by footprints, pure as possibility. Tomorrow, he said, I'll show you how Grace used to mend fence, how she'd talk to the cattle like they were people, how she'd calculate spring calf numbers in her head faster than I could do it with paper and pencil. I'll show you all the practical things, the skills that keep a ranch running. He turned back to Jake. But tonight I showed you an important thing, the thing that matters more than any skill. I showed you what it means to stand up when standing up costs everything, to choose honor over safety, to build something bigger than yourself. That's the real inheritance, not land, not money, but principle, purpose, the determination to make the world slightly better than you found it. Jake nodded, understanding settling deep in his bones. Thank you, he said, for trusting me with this, for believing I'm ready to hear it. You are ready, Cole said with certainty. You're 16. Same age Sarah was when her trouble started. Same age Grace was when she lost her mother. History has a way of repeating its rhythms, but you know the story now. You know what happens when people stand by versus when they stand up. You're armed with knowledge that Sarah and Grace didn't have. Use it wisely. Oh, and they prepared for bed then, and the story told, the lessons transmitted, the objects safely transferred to the next generation. Jake carried them to his room, placing them carefully in his travel bag, already planning how he'd protect them, preserve them, eventually pass them on himself. In his own room, Cole lay in the darkness, listening to the old house settle, feeling the weight of years, but also the satisfaction of duty fulfilled. He'd kept his promise to Grace. He'd told the story. He'd passed the torch. Whatever time remained to him now was grace period, bonus time to see what Jake and others like him would do with the lessons learned. Sleep came slowly, and with it, dreams. Dreams of snow and rope and a woman's whispered plea. Dreams of cutting through binding and watching freedom dawn in someone's eyes. Dreams of 31 years of partnership, of shared work and mutual respect, of a life built from the ashes of trauma into something strong and true and lasting. And in those dreams, Sarah was there too, finally at peace, smiling at her brother who'd learned too late to save her, but in time to save another, to break the cycle, to ensure that her death meant something beyond tragedy. The rope, the letter, the photograph. Three objects, three lessons, three pieces of a story that began in winter and ended in spring, but continued in the hearts and minds of those who heard it, learned from it, carried it forward. And somewhere in the space between memory and meaning, between past and future, between the old man sleeping and the young man lying awake contemplating what he'd learned, a legacy lived and breathed and waited for the moment when Jake would face his own rope, his own choice, his own chance to stand between injustice and the innocent. That moment would come, it always does, but now, armed with knowledge and example and the weight of history made personal, Jake would be ready. The winter reckoning had taught its lessons. The rope had been cut, the story had been told, and the legacy continued, as real and present as the snow outside, as permanent as the mountains, as necessary as breath itself. Some stories end, but the true ones never die. They just wait for someone young and brave enough to pick them up and carry them forward into whatever winters lie ahead.